Bibliophiles of the internet, today I'm here to share my incredibly queer June wrap-up. June was, of course, Pride Month here in the United States. Need I say more? I did the Queer Lit Readathon, the Queer Romance Readathon, and I just read a ton of queer books. I did make a separate Queer Lit Readathon wrap-up, as I usually do, so you can go watch that if you want my thoughts on Andre and Santi Were Here, The Perfect Crimes of Marian Hayes, Boys Run the Riot Volume 4, and The Many Half-Lived Lives of Sam Sylvester. So for this wrap-up, I'm going to pick up with what I read for the Queer Romance Readathon, starting with A Million Quiet Revolutions by Robin Gao, read by Kaden Catalina and Salem Corwin. I got this audiobook from my library. It's a recent release written by a debut trans author. It's a YA contemporary romance in verse about two trans boys who fall in love and come to realize their transness at the same time, and then together they're navigating that process. They discover these letters that were written between two revolutionary soldiers who they believe were trans, and they decide to not only take those soldiers' names as their own, but to start communicating with each other exclusively through their own letters. Right after they decide this, one of them, Aaron, has to move out of state, and these letters really become their lifeline to share their truths and make sure that they stay connected. In terms of representation, as I said, this is a T for T romance between two trans boys, and Aaron is Puerto Rican American as well. Content warnings for experienced homophobia, transphobia, dead naming, and misgendering, references to World War II, war imagery, death, and chattel slavery, as well as some exploration of religious trauma and references to off-page sexual abuse. I thought this was a really beautiful debut. The verse element gives the story a feeling of intimacy, closeness, and tenderness, and allows the speakers to be a bit more vulnerable than they might be otherwise. The unique spin on this epistolary format is also really interesting because it allows all the unnecessary details to fall to the wayside so that the dynamic of this intimate, complex T for T romance can really be the main focus. I also feel like the letters themselves are an extended metaphor for boundaries regarding transness, especially because in the digital age there's very little about ourselves that we don't share just because there's so much more access to people's lives and private thoughts and experiences. But to solely rely on written letters inherently shifts that dynamic and limits that access. It makes that communication much more intentioned, much more conscious, and it gives the writer more of a chance to consider what they want to share and what they don't. That space allows them to think about what they want to offer up and let the reader in on and what they want to keep for themselves. Obviously there's pros and cons, and I appreciate how the story is realistic about how Oliver and Aaron have to occasionally text or call each other about things that require an immediate response, but also about how that space and intention in their writing affects their relationship. There's also a really great through line in the story about queerness in relation to history. Obviously, with the discovery of these letters from revolutionary soldiers, there's a lot of reflection about the reclamation of historical queerness. These characters are having to confront the systemic erasure of queer existence throughout history, and learning about the precedents of people like them coming before them is very empowering in how they navigate their transness. There's something really powerful about the way they're interfacing with that history. They're not only discovering history and queering history in a way, but they're also making history by taking these soldiers' names and giving them new life in a completely different timeline and context. Also, while the whole white character, POC character romance is definitely a trend or trope of sorts that presents its own problems, I did appreciate how Aaron brings different experiences to the table and how he's able to engage with and point out Oliver's white privilege. Overall, I enjoyed this. I think it's a solid debut, and I would definitely check out more from this author in the future, so I gave this 4 stars. Then I read the group book for the Queer Romance Readathon, and that was Drag Me Up by R.M. Virtues. This is an indie erotic romance written by a trans-disabled indigenous Afro-Latina writer. It's sort of a modern AU take on Greek mythology, and this first book is a contemporary Hades Persephone retelling set in a casino/gambling district. It's not super easy to explain, but basically Hades and Zeus are competitors vying for power, and Persephone finds herself in debt to Zeus before the story begins. Then she lands herself a residency doing her aerial act at the casino Asphodel, which Hades runs, and they end up falling for each other, which puts a target on both of their backs. As far as representation goes, this is a black romance, and Hades is a queer demisexual man, and Persephone is queer and trans. Content warnings for experiences of stalking and harassment, references to past abuse, some instances of violence and gun violence, and somewhat obviously explicit sexual content. Before I get into it, I do want to recommend that you check out the Queer Romance Readathon live show that we did on Bethany's channel, where we talk not only about what we read for the week, personal highlights, etc., but we also engage in a pretty in-depth discussion of this book. We don't really get into spoilers from what I remember, so I think you're safe there, but I really love what everyone had to say about this story, and I'm mostly going to be echoing things that I said in that stream. I was pleasantly surprised by this book. I don't read a ton of erotica, not because I think it has any less value or because it makes me uncomfortable or anything like that, but just because as a demisexual person, there's usually a disconnect there for me in the content. But I think this story was kind of perfect in that respect because it felt like every piece, including the sexual piece, had clear intent and purpose. And to be perfectly clear, that does not mean that sexual content for the sake of sexual content doesn't have value. It definitely does. I've read it before, it certainly has a place. That said, this story has such an ease and such a flow to it because the sexual scenes fit in seamlessly with the thematic overtones of the story, which is to say that the characters are both contending with an imbalance of control and submission in their everyday lives. For Hades, he's being controlled and manipulated by Zeus, to whom he feels duty-bound, and his generosity is always being exploited because protecting Zeus from the consequences of his own actions is Hades' first instinct, and Zeus isn't afraid to take advantage of that weakness. So Hades is being forced to handle his brother's problems, and that often doesn't leave him room to live his own life. Persephone, on the other hand, is being controlled by her mother, Demeter, who doesn't care for her lifestyle or career choices. She's also being subjected to Zeus stalking and harassing her, feeling entitled to her because she accepted his help once and took on that debt. So there's all these forms of control that both characters are being unwillingly subjected to, which makes it all the more powerful and compelling when they can willfully engage with forms of control in consensual physical ways. Their relationship is definitely a safe space, shielding them from those outside forces, and I think that's definitely a big reason why you want to root for their success. Another thing I really appreciate, which someone very thoughtfully pointed out in my live reading sprints, is that the characters are facing external conflict as opposed to internal conflict. I don't think I've ever read about two characters more self-aware and self-fulfilled as Hades and Persephone in this story. They're both absolutely resolute in who they are, they have no problem implementing boundaries and checking each other, and their relationship is really a non-issue, which is kind of rare in adult romance. There is no miscommunication trope, there is no third act breakup, there are no deeply held secrets. The issues that they're dealing with are ones that they're facing together, and those problems are not caused because of them or their relationship. That is so refreshing to see in adult romance, and for R.M. Virtues to so easily defy all of those quote-unquote standard conventions of the genre on his first go is extremely impressive. Like I said, what I really love most is the strength of both these characters' convictions. They know exactly who they are, what they need, what they can do. They not only see themselves clearly, but they see each other clearly, and they can help each other draw healthy boundaries and recognize what they're responsible for and what they're not. Another thing I appreciate is that this retelling finally gives Hades the recognition he deserves. Zeus is rightfully and finally cast as the villain because he's disgusting, manipulative, and abusive, and Hades gets to be the decisive leader and confidant he was always meant to be. And I love that he's also given this space to be kind, understanding, and soft. In short, there's a lot to love about this retelling. It hit me surprisingly hard, and I think it's able to strike that perfect balance between emotion, character growth, and steaminess in a way that's incredibly satisfying to read. The world building isn't the best in my opinion, but that's definitely not a make or break thing. I still gave this 4.5 stars. Then I read one of my new all-time favorite books that is now becoming a part of my official brand, and that is Exodus 23 by Freydis Moon. This is a 70-page novelette written by a queer trans-biracial Latina author. It's a dark adult fantasy romance about Diego, a Mexican-American trans man, sex worker, and former delinquent who's trying to put his past behind him and focus on his community service, which is to help rebuild a small church. He has to travel to a small town in New Mexico to do it, and the only other person for miles is the church groundskeeper, Ariel, an attractive, mysterious man who ignites something deep in Diego's soul, and who might just turn out to be one of God's original creations. Content warnings for off-page experiences of transphobia, off-page references to police brutality, some mentions of drug use, and some descriptions of consensual sex work and other explicit sexual content. In terms of representation, as I said, Diego is a Mexican-American trans man who has undergone top surgery and is on hormones, and Ariel, even though he's not technically human, identifies as being from Brazil. All the credit for this recommendation to my dear friend Luce from Things Lucy Reads for sharing this book and their stories and officially winning the award for convincing me to make my fastest ever purchase. Luce, you saved my life. I owe you everything. This book became part of my soul. I absorbed it into my DNA. It is forever part of my genetic makeup. I carry it with me everywhere I go because it was just perfectly written for and catered towards me specifically in every imaginable respect. First of all, I just felt incredibly seen with Diego, who is a Mexican-American trans person who's undergone medical transition. And I don't want to place over-importance on medical transition, but that's just a kind of representation that you do not often get to see in books. I've literally read thousands of books in my lifetime, and this might be the first one featuring a Mexican character who has had that particular combination of experiences. So yes, that means something to me. Just to see the possibility of my own experiences reflected back to me and validated means more than any star rating can possibly encompass. Even putting that aside, this story is still just phenomenal. My personal tagline every time I talk about it is to say that this book may have single-handedly healed my religious trauma in a major way. This is exactly how I want to see queer Mexican characters engaging with Catholicism, to literally look it in the eyes and fuck with it every chance they get. Jokes aside, this story fundamentally understands how traumatizing and volatile of a space religion can be for people who are queer and trans. It can be very literally unsafe, and I appreciate how the story gives Diego the space to engage with it on his own terms. Not only that, but my favorite thing about this story is that Ariel, as a divine entity, is able to revere, respect, and recognize Diego's transness as being holy in and of itself. He is uniquely able to recognize the power and conviction it takes to be the arbiter of your own creation, to see a version of yourself that no one else can see and make it flesh, to demand recognition from a world that is all too often unwilling to believe in that which it cannot understand or experience. The parallels of both Ariel and Diego being masters of creation in their own ways and inhabiting an omnipotent space where they can both experience and become versions of themselves that no one else would even be capable of imagining is so much more powerful than I can possibly explain in words. That's also part of why this connection strikes me so deeply, because as much as Ariel is being worshipped by Diego, Diego is being worshipped right back as an equal through and explicitly because of his transness. This story also made me think about the connection between transition and faith, because faith is believing in that which you cannot see or fully understand or predict. Taking steps to physically and medically transition, if that's your path, also requires a kind of faith, even if it's not the kind of faith we're taught about through institutionalized religion. Because you cannot predict what's on the other side, and yet you continue believing in it and you continue towards it regardless. Again, for transness to be framed in such a way with such reverence and respect, to see it named for the divinity it explicitly encompasses by definition, changed me in a way that I cannot fully describe. And the steamy parts of this story just rendered me speechless, obliterated me, made me melt into the floorboards, and made my soul physically detach from the hollowed out shell of my body. There were parts of this that made me blush to the point of tears. I'm not going to go into more detail about that, but besides the thematic resonances, the way religious imagery is used and repurposed and recontextualized in those moments is also extremely quality content. There was nothing about this I did not love. You can rip it from my cold dead hands. I literally don't care what any of you think about it if you read it, because it was for me. I will read anything Frey This Moon writes until the end of time. I gave this its well-deserved 5 stars. Difficult to pivot away from that energy, but the last book I listened to for the Queer Romance Readathon was She Drives Me, insert ableist C word here, by Kelly Quinlan, read by Piper Goodeve. Now I do want to quickly acknowledge that obviously, yes, I'm censoring the last word in the title because it is historically ableist. I understand that the use of that word may not have been intentionally harmful on the author's part, but words still mean things regardless. I do also want to acknowledge that I did say the full title in my queer sports books video, I believe, but that was really uncomfortable for me throughout the entire process. I should not have done that, and I wished I had made different choices. So going forward, even if a book title contains certain words, I have decided that I myself do not have to perpetuate harmful language. Thank you for coming to my TED Talk. This is a YA sapphic rom-com. It's a rivals to romance story between the captain of the basketball team and head cheerleader, and everything starts after Scotty experiences a crushing defeat in front of not only the entire school and town, but also at the hands of her ex. Right after that game, she's not thinking clearly, and she ends up getting into a fender bender with the cheerleading captain, Irene. As if that wasn't enough, Scotty's mom forces both of them into carpooling with each other until Irene's car is fixed. As they begin to spend more time together, Scotty comes up with a fake dating scheme to not only help both of them climb the social hierarchy and help Irene win Student Athlete of the Year, but that will also have the added benefit of making Scotty's ex jealous. Content warnings for instances of past bullying, multiple HP references, explorations of past toxic relationships, explorations of homophobia, both internal and external, underage drinking, drunkenness, and drug use, vomit, and some casually ableist language. For the most part, I like this. It's easy and enjoyable to listen to, delightfully tropey, really makes a meal out of all those classic rom-com conventions. It's funny, fast-paced, has great friend and family dynamics, and I think it also has a great message. What I appreciate most about this story is that it's able to have fun with those rom-com shenanigans, but it also paints a very empathetic portrait of two characters who are dealing with the trauma from past relationships as they work their way towards a new romance. I wasn't expecting this story to explore the long-lasting effects of toxic relationships in so much depth, and I think the story is able to do that without being graphic or gratuitous or exploiting that trauma, but rather merely acknowledging that it's something that both characters actively experience. For Irene, she had a past situationship with someone else on the cheerleading squad who was willing to quote-unquote experiment with her, but was very inwardly and outwardly homophobic, which is obviously something that leaves its own marks. Scotty has a very manipulative and toxic ex as well, who constantly wants to be in her business and keep a close eye on everything she's doing, even when she's not entitled to know, and Scotty still feels shackled to this girl's expectations in many ways. So I really respect how the story navigates those emotional complexities, the way it shows how the lingering effects of those relationships impact the way both characters see themselves and also connect with others, and how it forces both of them to realize that they need to work on themselves first and foremost. It's kind of rare that we get to see YA romances where both characters are working through their own baggage and really putting the act of bringing their best selves into a romance into practice. So that was definitely satisfying to read. What kept me from loving this book personally was that I felt there were still some weird power dynamics at play. One thing that really bothered me, which I did mention in the Queer Romance Readathon live show, is that this isn't just a fake dating scheme. Scotty's actually paying Irene to pretend to be her girlfriend. I want to be clear, it's not explicitly set up in such a direct way because Scotty's paying for something else in Irene's life that will essentially free her up to do the fake dating thing in the first place. That feels weird to me, not only because it's a white character paying off a character of color, which is already a dicey dynamic, but also because money introduces a very specific kind of difference in power and privilege. When it comes to fake dating schemes, especially between teenagers, I don't need any kind of monetary incentive to buy into it, and I don't think the situation calls for it either. Fake dating schemes arise when both characters would benefit in some way, and that fair exchange is already in place to begin with. And what's more, I don't think the story ever meaningfully sort of contends with that difference in power and privilege. Again, it just introduces an unnecessary power imbalance, and that plotline also falls to the wayside as the story progresses, so I just don't think it's needed. The other thing that made me a bit uncomfortable was that even though Irene consents to the fake dating, it essentially forces her to publicly come out. Again, she does consent. She does know their relationship has to be public for this scheme to work. She feels relatively ready to do it. But even so, the prospect of coming out for something that's fake still doesn't quite sit right. Again, to be clear, this is still a very sweet, tropey, enjoyable romance overall. There were just a few parts that were a bit questionable in my opinion, but I do appreciate the relationship Irene and Scotty are working towards in the end, and I gave this a solid 3 stars. The next thing I listened to was my Patreon pick for June, and that was Flip the Script by Lila Lee, read by Greta Jung. Lila Lee is the author of I'll Be the One, which is an exceptional queer MF romance. This story is set in Korea and follows an up-and-coming bisexual K-drama star named Hana, who's just been cast in her first leading role, but the ratings for their premiere episode are not super great. So the production company suggests that she and her co-star Brian enter into a contractual fake relationship to drum up some publicity, which is pretty par for the course, but then Hana's also taken by surprise when they bring on a second actress to play a new love interest. Everyone knows not to fall in love with the second lead on a K-drama, but the more time Hana spends with Minji, the more she realizes that this is actually the person she might want to date. In terms of representation, all the supporting characters are Korean. Hana is a Korean-American immigrant, Brian is pansexual, Hana is bisexual, and while she never explicitly uses a label, Minji states that she is exclusively into girls. Content warnings for instances of sexism, misogyny, and online harassment, some experiences of xenophobia and homophobia, and some discussions of public outing. I'm so glad my patrons voted for me to read this book. It was one of my most anticipated 2022 releases, and it definitely did not disappoint. I love how this story defies and subverts so many expectations and cliches. Like when you first meet Brian, you assume he's going to be this narcissistic crossover K-pop star who thinks he's better than Hana. You assume this fake relationship is going to cause a lot of problems, but they actually end up being really good friends. We definitely need to see more celebrations of platonic, loving relationships between queer people just like this, and I appreciate how something that starts off as a business transaction blooms into something genuine. There's a similar subversion with Minji, who you expect to become rivals with Hana as they play competing love interests, but there's really no hostility that exists between them. I also just really enjoyed their relationship because they actually have a history together as classmates and friends. Minji isn't just some random actress who comes on set, and that creates a far more interesting friends to rivals to friends to girlfriends kind of dynamic. I also think it's awesome that this story takes place entirely in Korea, especially because the United States and Western society are far too often centered in fiction. This story actively challenges Western centrism and attempts to show the complexities of Korean society, which is both beautiful and challenging in its own ways. There's definitely a lot of commentary on celebrity culture in Korea, the cultural impact of K-dramas and other forms of entertainment on society at large, how creative industries operate very differently than they would in the States, and I just think this story has so much valuable insight to offer in that sense. So the fact that this story offers a unique look at the K-drama industry and Korean society is awesome, and I also appreciate how the story shows queer characters existing, thriving, and caring for each other even in the midst of a very conservative society. The story doesn't pull any punches when it comes to exploring Korea's conservative views on queerness, and it's definitely something all the characters have to take into consideration as they navigate very public lives. I love the characters going on this journey of becoming the representation they've always wanted to see in the world, and how there's a recognition of the fact that entertainment and media have a significant impact on how culture itself is understood, created, and shaped. There's definitely a lot of good in this story. It's fun, it's hopeful, it makes use of a lot of celebrity romance tropes, it centers a sweet sapphic romance. It gave me chills from a fake slapping scene, which I did not know could be romantic, but there you are, so I enjoyed it. I give it 4 stars. In the interest of full disclosure, my schedule is the worst kind of chaotic this week, so I'm filming a bit early. I am still in the middle of 2 queer books, High Risk Homosexual by Edgar Gomez and Keep Me Close by R.M. Virtues. I don't know if I'll finish them before the end of Pride, but I will finish them soon, and then they will be reviewed somewhere on the internet. As always, if you've read any of these books yourself, or if you plan to, feel free to drop your thoughts in the comments down below, or let me know about your favorite book that you read in June. But that's everything I had to share for today. Thank you so much for watching, and until next time, educate yourself, be kind to yourself, take care of yourself, and I will catch you on the flip side of the page.